Thank you very much. I want to bring the tone down a little bit now after that. But can you please put your hand up if you've spent a significant time in a prison, maybe as a worker or as a guest? Very few, maybe 5%. And that might even be a little bit high because of the number of First Nations people we have in our audience today. And can I acknowledge the challenge that you face with the justice system, and also to recognise I'm standing on your land. So the majority of you have not been inside the prison walls. So I'm making an assumption that you know very little about how prisons work, what they look like and what they smell like. But you should, because prisons reflect the community they exist in. You want safer streets, you want to reduce crime, you want to build a better community, learn more about your prisons. And I hope in the very short time I have with you today that I can set you on the path to doing that. Because I was like the majority of you. I knew very little about prisons, and yet I stand before you now as an advocate for prison reform. So I've been on a journey. And as Tim said, that journey started in Melbourne many years ago, where I was born into a loving, caring family. And my father, Niel, was a very important man in our town. He served a term as mayor. He ran a business that employed migrants, and he volunteered for many charities and many community organisations. He always looked for a better way, and he always challenged the status quo. I walked out of his funeral 8 years ago in the firm knowledge that a life dedicated to community service is a life worth living. And lo and behold, out of thin air, 2 years later, I was offered a job in community service. I'm still there. I work for an organisation that helps prisoners get ready for release, and when they are released, to reintegrate into the community. We help them get out and stay out. Over that time, I've learnt a lot. One thing I learnt was that this gig is a gift. I get to work with beautiful, passionate people and the weirdest and wackiest group of clients you ever want to meet. Some of the lessons I learnt were many. But the main one I've learned is there is a huge cohort in our community that live in a cycle of disadvantage, where trauma and violence and crime and prison are a normal part of life. And increasingly at work, I saw staff getting frustrated with their inability to help a lot of these clients. And I saw clients making decisions that were not in their best interests. Despite our best efforts, our clients were returning to prison. Why? I went looking for answers. And you've had a sneak peek at this, but this is the first one. Jailing is failing. I'm not a bleeding heart. I believe that there are many people in our community, for their safety and the safety of the community, they should be locked up. I have no doubt my father would agree. But in his day, we locked up 9 people in every 10,000. We're now locking up 23. Have a look at this graph. The prison population in Australia is exploding. The government brought down its Productivity Commission report 4 months ago, and it said the prison population is increasing for 3 reasons. 1, it's very hard to access bail. 2, courts don't have enough flexibility. And 3, parole is looked on as a risk factor, not a rehabilitation opportunity. The little dip at the end, well, the pandemic's had an effect on everything. Governments were very quick to recognise that prisons are no more than a stationary cruise ship. So to keep filling them full of passengers was not a good move. So looking at those things I mentioned before, there have been subtle changes in the way courts look at crime and the way we look at bail and parole. As a consequence, we've been able to reduce prison numbers. The important lesson here is that we've been able to do it without changing government policy or legislation. We can reduce prison numbers in this country within the current framework. But governments have a love affair with prisons. You can't be elected to government in Australia unless you're perceived to be tough on law and order. And governments, their politicians and the people who elect them believe locking people up and throwing away the key is being tough on law and order. I used to believe that, and the people I grew up with probably still do. But the evidence says otherwise. 20 years ago, which is not a long time ago, we used to lock up 21,000 prisoners in this country, and 33% of them returned to prison. We now lock up 44,000 prisoners, and 46% of them return to prison within 2 years. How can this be viewed as a successful system? How can this be viewed as being tough on law and order? We need prisons that change behaviour. Prison officers do a fantastic job keeping their prisons safe and secure. That's their priority, and rightly so. But we need to bring more rehabilitative services into the prisons. Every government in Australia audits its own prisons regularly, and those audit reports always have a section saying more rehabilitation services, please. So what to do? We as an organisation will continue to lobby government for change. We hope they would look overseas and see some successful models of what does work. The Justice Reform Initiative has been established in Australia recently, and that is a very well-run, well-resourced lobby group for change. And it has some very heavy hitters as patrons. 2 former Governors-General are part of that. And we hope that will have an influence. And I'm seeing a slight shift in what governments are doing in a positive way. But the reason they're shifting is the increase in prison populations is increasing the cost. It costs us close to $6 billion a year to run our prison system. The cost of incarceration for one person per year in Australia is $130,000. So we need to look at change. And we hope that if governments do blink, more money will come to us as an organisation so we can start providing meaningful rehabilitation services within prison. Question, rhetorical. What is the age of criminal responsibility in Australia? That's the age when we can lock somebody up. So what is the minimum age of criminal responsibility? What were you like at 14? Did you know the consequences of your decisions? Did you know right from wrong? Probably. And the United Nations tends to agree because it has recommended that the minimum age for incarceration in any of its member countries is 14. In Australia, it's 10. We can lock up a 10-year-old. Now, is this being tough on law and order, or is it just plain stupid? 30 members of the United Nations wrote to Australia last year asking it to raise the age. So far, we've said no. This is unfortunate and to me reflects government's attitudes to incarceration in this country. I'd like to do a little exercise with you now. It won't take long and it's painless. Maybe it's not painless. But can you think of someone in your life you care about, probably a young adult, and this person has been convicted of a crime and is going to prison. Not for a heinous or repugnant crime, but the type of crime that the mothers and the family say, he's really a good boy. She just got in with the wrong crowd. So this person is going to prison now. What services and what support do you want to see that person you love and care about receive while they're in prison? And what services do you want to see that person you love and care about when they're released and reintegrating into the community? When you think about prisons, think about them in that context. Because that's the prison system we need, and that's the prison system that works. My journey continued. And it arrived at a destination where I found something that seems to permeate everything we do in our office. Disadvantage. Nearly all prisoners come from some form of disadvantage. Consider this list. This is the current makeup of the prison population in Australia. These are the government's own figures, so the numbers are a little low, but just consider them. I certainly don't want to go through them all, but can I highlight that 40% of prisoners in Australia at the moment have had or have a mental health condition diagnosed. The actual figure is much, much higher, and anyone who's ever worked in the prison system will tell you that. But it's led practitioners like myself and the people I work with to view prisons as the asylums of the 21st century. Now have another look at this list and picture yourself, imagine, and I know there will be people in this audience that don't have to imagine this, but imagine being an unemployed Indigenous person with a mental health condition who's had one parent incarcerated. Is your future written? I think it is. And if you think about those things, these are things of no fault of that person. That's just what they were born into. So, prisoners come from disadvantage. They go to prison. They're released from prison. Where do they end up? Back in the disadvantage. This is the cycle of recidivism. This is what we have to slow down. 2 case studies. Cliff, not his real name, was released from prison 8 years ago after having a very colourful criminal and prison history. He's managed to stay out that long, but the first 6 years of his time outside, he was homeless and he lived in his car. During that time, he was bashed, he was abused, he was robbed, and he presented at the hospital many times with physical and mental health conditions. After 6 years, we found him a home. He's not perfect, but he's much better. He's healthier, he's engaged in the community, and I'm confident that Cliff is not going back to prison. Cliff was also part of the National Redress System, and last year he received a small amount of compensation for the abuse that he had suffered in government institutions. Late last year, he received a phone call in our office from the government where they actually apologised for the abuse he received. Everyone in the room cried that day. Jenny, Indigenous female, was released from a metropolitan prison, came into our area and was lucky enough to have accommodation, and she was doing really well. Unfortunately, the visitors that were turning up at her place stayed. And after a while, she was subject to domestic violence and other forms of abuse. She was too scared to go to the authorities. Under the stress of this, her previously bad behaviours returned, and she eventually ended up homeless in the streets of Perth. You may have walked past her. When she hit rock bottom, by some miracle, she was able to contact us. And through our great casework, we were able to get her into a rehabilitation facility. That facility is 700 kilometres away. We don't have one in our region. She's finished her rehab now. She's in employment. She's doing really well. She's a poster girl for that organisation, and she has made public speeches about her journey, and there's been articles written about her in the press. We're trying to get her back to the region, but we don't have a house for her. Think of Cliff and Jenny. They're our success stories. I told you before, at the moment, 46% of prisoners go back to prison within 2 years. They're not that group. They're the 54 that stay out. They are the successes. But look how hard we made it for them. Look at the barriers and the obstacles the community put in front of them. Let's dispel this myth that people go back to prison because it's simple and they get 3 meals a day. That is not why they go back to prison. They go back to prison because we make it so hard for them to stay out. So, what are we doing about it? 4 years ago, I was at a national conference and I heard Professor Joe Gaffin, a wonderful man. He's a professor at Deakin University in Melbourne. He spoke about a hub of services for released prisoners. So prisoners come into a hub of services and they can access any service that meets their needs. At the same time, people from the community can come into that service and again access services that meet their needs. We like this idea, and 3 years ago we established the Great Southern Community Hub. And within the hub we established these 10 domains of need. Anyone can come into our hub, and if we can't directly help them, we can refer them to the service that can. It's an integrated collaborative model of service provision, and it's working well because we had 434 individual clients come through this service last year. but the governments don't see the importance of it. We self-fund this. And if we can't find a sustainable funding stream for this in 12 months' time, we might have to make some difficult decisions. Father John Brosnan was the prison chaplain at Pentridge Prison in Melbourne for 30 years. And he said there's 3 things that keep prisoners out of prison: a home, a job, and the ability to stay away from your dickhead mates. That is as true today as it was in Father John's time. But we've expanded that list because we're not just working with prisoners now, we are working on the disadvantage in the community as a whole. So, my journey. From a privileged, white, middle-class background, I was offered the gift of a job where, from evidence and experience, I've come to the conclusion that jailing is failing. We need more rehabilitation in our prisons. But my journey took me further upstream to look at the disadvantage that is in the community and how are we going to address that. We believe we can do it, and we've shown that we can over the last 3 years through our community hub. And if we succeed in doing what we want to do in this hub, we're going to slow that cycle of recidivism. We're going to help the Cliff and Jennies of the world, and we're going to make our community somewhere that I would be proud to live in, and I know you would too. Thank you.